A White House directive under fire as officials confirm alarming interference.
New documents show Trump's inner circle leaning on DHS in a trafficking investigation gone explosive.
Sources say the White House was caught red-handed pressuring agents to return seized devices.
Okay, hold on. What in the world is happening inside this White House right now? Because the moment you think they've hit rock bottom, they pull out a shovel and start digging. And today we're looking at something so blatant, so reckless, so unbelievably corrupt that even longtime DHS officials are saying they've never seen anything like it. And that's not hyperbole, that's not spin, that's not opinion. That's a direct quote from people who actually lived through it. So here's what just happened. While the country was busy watching Trump rage about immunity or polls or whatever imaginary crisis he's cooking up this week, the real crisis was playing out behind the scenes. The White House, Trump's White House, was caught red-handed pressuring DHS to hand back electronic devices seized in an active sex trafficking investigation involving the Tate brothers. Yes, those Tate brothers, the ones facing human trafficking and rape charges in Romania and the UK, the ones who literally said the good old days are back. And apparently, they weren't wrong, because here's the part that should make every American stop what they're doing. A senior White House official actually sent a directive to Border Protection telling them to give the devices back, in writing, as if federal agents were just supposed to say, oh, sure, suspected traffickers, international charges, evidence, no worries, the White House said so.
And before anyone tries to rewrite this as some sort of bureaucratic misunderstanding, no. According to DHS insiders, the order wasn't subtle, it wasn't vague, it wasn't a suggestion, it was pressure, it was an expectation. And it was the kind of interference that federal agents described as offensive, shocking, and completely outside protocol. These are people who deal with threats, smugglers, cartel cases, you name it. And this is what rattled them. But here's what makes this even worse. Trump and his allies are right now screaming about political witch hunts, weaponization, deep state conspiracies, all while they themselves were leaning on law enforcement to protect accused traffickers. The hypocrisy is so loud you can practically hear it echoing off the West Wing walls. And yes, we're going to get into who sent the letter, why they were able to send it, and how deeply this connects to Trump's network. We're going to get into why DHS officials describe the entire thing as a red flag, and why the timeline of events raises some extremely serious questions about intent. But here's the question that should be keeping people up tonight. If they're willing to interfere in a trafficking case this blatantly, what else are they willing to do behind the scenes that we haven't discovered yet? Because this wasn't sloppy. It wasn't desperate. It was confident. It was entitled. It was the behavior of people who genuinely believe there are no rules left. And the craziest part? This story gets even worse. Much worse.
And here's where everything really starts to unravel. Because the moment you dig into the timeline, the motive, and the players involved, the whole thing stops looking like a one-off abuse of power and starts looking like a coordinated pattern. A pattern we've seen from Trump for years. When the law comes knocking, he doesn't move out of the way, he pushes back. Hard. And he pushes in a way that tells you he genuinely believes federal agencies exist to serve him, not the country. So let's start with the basics. The Tate brothers land in Florida earlier this year. They're under international scrutiny. They're facing trafficking charges. They've been accused by multiple women in multiple countries. Romanian prosecutors have spent more than a year building a case. UK prosecutors have leveled more than 20 charges. These aren't allegations from anonymous Twitter accounts. These are actual criminal prosecutions. And what happens the moment they land? Customs and Border Protection does exactly what they're supposed to do. They seize electronic devices, phones, laptops, drives, because investigators believe they may contain evidence tied to active trafficking cases abroad. This is routine. This is procedure. This is what happens when you're under serious charges and you show up on U.S. soil. There's nothing political about it, nothing shady, nothing irregular. In fact, the only irregular thing about it was what came afterward.
Okay, hold on, because that detail alone should be setting off alarms everywhere. Think about what this actually means. A senior official in the Trump White House sends a directive telling those federal agents to return the seized devices to the Tate brothers. And not just a polite inquiry, not a, hey, what's the status? It was a push described by insiders as pressure, coming from a man who already had a documented history of extremist ideology and who had personal ties to the Tates. This wasn't random. This wasn't bureaucratic overlap. This was someone with power, access, and a direct line to Trump telling DHS agents to stand down. Okay, hold on, because that detail alone should be setting off alarms everywhere. Think about what this actually means. A White House official attempted to override federal law enforcement to benefit individuals accused of sex trafficking. How do you even justify that? How do you defend that? How do you spin that as anything other than blatant interference? And yeah, you're not going to believe this, but the person sending that message wasn't even Senate confirmed because he couldn't survive a confirmation hearing. Why? Because of his racist comments, extremist rhetoric, and literal glorification of Nazism. That's not speculation. That's not an insult. That's on record. And somehow, Trump still put him in a position with direct influence over Homeland Security. A man too toxic for Republican senators was somehow perfect for Trump's inner circle.
But that's not even the surprising part, because once ProPublica exposed the letter and the pressure, DHS officials who were actually present came forward anonymously, saying they were disgusted, offended, and shocked by the interference. These are law enforcement officers who've seen cartel violence, trafficking rings, terrorism threats, you name it. They've lived through the worst things you can imagine. And yet this is what rattled them? This is what they described as crossing the line? That should tell you everything. Let me break it down even further because people need to understand the gravity of what was happening. When federal agents seize devices in a case tied to trafficking, those devices often contain critical evidence, messages, images, transactions, communications, patterns, maps. Human trafficking investigations rely heavily on electronic forensics. Returning those devices early is not just improvised incompetence. It potentially compromises evidence. It potentially helps suspects align stories. It potentially lets networks reorganize. It potentially shields perpetrators. And knowing that, the White House still stepped in. And here's the twist nobody saw coming. Trump and his allies have spent the last 2 years attacking federal law enforcement for being weaponized, for being political, for being biased, for being out to get conservatives. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, they're the ones weaponizing federal agencies, not to punish enemies, but to protect allies accused of trafficking minors. That's the political hypocrisy that just rips the mask off.
Now, here's where things get even stranger. The same week the letter was sent, Florida's state attorney general allegedly opened or considered opening an investigation into the Tate brothers' arrival in the state. But after the White House involvement, silence. No comment. No public update. Nothing. Do you really think that's a coincidence? Do you really think the timing doesn't matter? Because the pattern is very clear. The Trump's people move, the pressure builds, and Florida officials suddenly go quiet. Let's be extremely clear about one thing. This isn't about the Tates themselves. This is about power. This is about what people with power think they're entitled to do. And Trump's inner circle has always behaved like law enforcement exists to follow their orders. Not the law, not process, not protocol. Them, and only them. And the public deserves to understand exactly why this matters. Because if the White House can interfere in a trafficking investigation involving international suspects with pending charges, then what can't they interfere in? Immigration cases? Drug cases? Political cases? Cases against Republican donors? Cases involving foreign governments? The boundaries start to disappear. And when boundaries disappear, the rule of law disappears with them. But stay with me, because this gets even more disturbing. While the White House was busy trying to get these devices returned to accused traffickers, guess what else was happening? 2 other stories broke almost simultaneously, and they paint a picture that should terrify every single person in this country.
A Trump-pardoned January 6 rioter was arrested for molesting a child and bragging that he'd pay the child off with the $10 million he expected to get from suing the government for his prosecution.
And in Minnesota, an ICE employee was caught in a sting trying to buy sex from someone he believed was a minor, telling officers, "I'm ICE boys," as if that somehow entitled him to walk away. The overlap isn't subtle, it's not random, it's not a coincidence, it's a culture. A culture where people aligned with Trump believe they're untouchable. A culture where consequences are optional. A culture where if you're loyal to the right man, you can break any law, step over any boundary, and still expect protection. And the White House's interference with the Tate investigation isn't just another example. It's the clearest one yet. Now here's the real question. What was so important on those devices that someone inside Trump's White House would rather pressure DHS than let investigators do their job? Because if this was innocent, they wouldn't have intervened. If there were no political stakes, they wouldn't have intervened. If there was nothing to lose, they wouldn't have intervened. So the fact that they did tells you exactly what you need to know. And incredibly, the story only gets darker from here.
And let's be clear about something here, because no one in Trump's orbit is ever going to admit it. You don't try to claw back seized devices in a trafficking investigation unless you're afraid of what's on them. Period. Full stop. And the desperation in this move, this weird, frantic attempt to pull evidence out of federal hands, tells you everything about where Trump's inner circle is mentally right now. They're not confident, they're not calm, they're not pretending everything is under control. They're acting like people who see a fire spreading and are trying to smother it with their bare hands. And the more we look at this, the more obvious it becomes that this isn't just about the Tates. It's not even about the case itself. It's about what the Tates represent to Trump. Two ultra-online influencers, massively followed among young men, aggressively pro-Trump, aggressively anti-institutional, aggressively willing to say the quiet parts out loud. They are exactly the kind of people Trump wants in his corner. And the fact that someone inside the White House moves so quickly, so aggressively to protect them should make everyone stop pretending this is some minor procedural hiccup. But here's where things get even wilder. The official who sent that letter, who pushed DHS to return the devices, was someone who should never have been anywhere near government power in the first place. We're talking about a man who openly embraced extremist rhetoric, who publicly posted Nazi references, who repeatedly failed Senate confirmation because even Republicans couldn't stomach putting him in a position of authority. And Trump didn't just keep him around, he elevated him, gave him access, let him operate in the shadows. And what did he do with that access? He used it to protect accused traffickers.
Now, if this were a normal administration, if this were any president other than Donald Trump, this would be the biggest scandal in Washington. There would be wall-to-wall coverage. There would be crisis briefings. There would be congressional hearings. There would be resignations. But under Trump, it barely scratches the surface of the weekly chaos cycle. And that's part of the problem. The constant stream of corruption has numbed people into believing this is normal. It's not normal. It's not close to normal. This is the exact kind of interference we accuse authoritarian governments of doing. And because this is Trump, the hypocrisy is just unbelievable. This is the same guy who spent years screaming about law and order, who promised to restore respect for law enforcement, who told his supporters that Democrats were the ones protecting criminals. Meanwhile, his own White House was interfering, directly interfering, in a trafficking case. Think about the mental gymnastics you'd need to perform to justify that. And here's the part they really hate, the public reaction. Because the moment the story broke, the reaction wasn't, look at the deep state. It wasn't, this is fake news. It wasn't even witch hunt. It was pure disbelief. People don't shrug off the idea of White House interference in a trafficking investigation. Even Republicans who usually rush to defend Trump went noticeably silent. Not outraged, not supportive, silent. Because there's no talking point for this. You can't spin protecting accused traffickers as some heroic patriotic act. You can't rebrand this as fighting the deep state. There's no Fox News monologue that makes this look good. And that silence, coming from Trump's defenders, is the loudest thing in this story.
Okay, hold on. Let's be clear. Here's the part that really matters. And yeah, this is wild. A pardoned January 6 rioter arrested for sexually abusing a child. an ICE worker caught trying to buy sex from a minor, and now the White House trying to help accused traffickers. And every time, the reaction from Trump's circle is the same. Blame the media, blame the FBI, blame Democrats, blame witch hunts, blame political prosecutions, anything except the actual actions of the people involved. And that's the point. Trump has created an ecosystem where accountability doesn't exist, where crimes aren't condemned, they're excused, where the only thing that matters is loyalty. And when loyalty is the only currency, people start assuming that the rules don't apply to them. They start assuming they're protected. They start assuming they can do whatever they want and someone in power will clean up the mess for them. And guess what? They're right. Or at least they've been right up until now. Because here's the thing Trump didn't count on. Federal agents talk. When you cross a line this severe, when you interfere this blatantly in a trafficking case, the people inside DHS don't just shrug and move on. They notice, they remember, they tell reporters, they go on the record anonymously, they leak, they refuse to be complicit. And that's exactly what happened here. These agents didn't stay quiet, they didn't play along, they told ProPublica exactly what happened.
Okay, hold on. This is where the cracks start to show. Once this story hit, the White House went into full panic mode. Statements started shifting, explanations were contradictory, the official involved claimed he never did anything, then claimed he couldn't recall, then claimed the entire story was being misrepresented, then claimed the letter was routine. These aren't the reactions of innocent people. These are the reactions of people who didn't expect to get caught. And oh, they got caught. But what does this mean politically? Because that's the part the media always glosses over. They treat every Trump scandal like a moral question when it's actually a structural question. What does this mean for Trump's ability to wield power? What does this mean for how federal agencies operate under him? What does this mean for a second term where he's vowed to purge the government of career officials and replace them with loyalists? Well, here's what it means. This is a preview. This is the blueprint. This is the demonstration of exactly how he intends to use government power if he ever gets it back again. And if he's willing to interfere in a trafficking case now, when he's not even fully in control, imagine what he'll do if he has total control. And here's the twist nobody wants to say out loud. This scandal didn't just expose corruption. It exposed vulnerability. Trump's Inner Circle tried to control a law enforcement process and failed. They tried to pull rank and were resisted. They tried to bury a federal operation and whistleblowers came forward. That's not strength. That's weakness. That's a White House operating in fear. And the question becomes, fear of what?
Okay, hold on. Let's be clear. Here's the part that really matters. And yeah, this is wild. Because once you strip away the noise, once you push past the political framing, the unanswered question in the middle of this story is the one everyone is avoiding. What exactly did they think investigators were going to find on those devices? And that's where things truly start to spiral. And the more you look at this entire situation, the more you realize that the real story isn't just the interference, it's the fear underneath it. Because nobody moves this aggressively unless they're scared of exposure. Nobody tries to rip evidence out of federal hands unless they think that evidence is dangerous. And nobody inside Trump's orbit goes out on a limb like this unless they believe the fallout could land directly on him. And here's the piece that isn't being talked about nearly enough. The Tate brothers aren't just random figures who copped onto Trump's radar. They've been part of an entire online ecosystem that overlaps heavily with Trump's political base. Young men radicalized into believing the system is rigged, institutions are corrupt, and the only truth comes from bombastic personalities who tell them what they want to hear. Trump has leaned into that demographic for years because it gives him something he desperately needs: amplification. The Tates give him that. The Tates speak to an audience he can't reach himself. And the moment they started facing charges overseas, that entire influence pipeline was suddenly in jeopardy. So when the Tates landed in Florida and federal agents seized their devices, it wasn't just the story of two individuals under investigation. It was the story of a political machine protecting one of its spokesmen. And once you understand that part, the White House's panic makes a lot more sense. This wasn't a favor for friends. This wasn't charity. This was political self-preservation disguised as executive authority.
And we're supposed to believe that the order to return those devices was just some clerical suggestion? Please. If there's one thing the last decade has taught us, it's that nothing in Trump's orbit happens accidentally. Every move is self-serving. Every action is transactional. Every intervention has a motive. And in this case, the motive could not be clearer. Shield the voices that shield him. But there's another layer that's even more revealing. Think about the psychology of Trump's team. They've spent years blurring the line between legal and illegal, ethical and unethical, normal and outrageous. They don't see law enforcement as an independent institution. They see it as a tool. And tools exist to be used or misused, depending on what benefits them. So of course they thought they could pressure DHS. Of course they thought they could override agents. Of course they thought a letter from a White House official would make everything disappear. And then they hit a wall. Career federal agents who refuse to play along. People whose loyalty is to the law, not to Trump. People who had every opportunity to cave and didn't. And that's where the panic really started. Because Trump's inner circle isn't used to being told no. They're not used to oversight. They're not used to resistance. They're used to bending institutions until they break. But this time, the institution pushed back. This time, the agents didn't fold. This time, the whistleblowers spoke.
And when systems Trump thinks he controls suddenly stop obeying him, he loses it every time. That's why he spiraled over the DOJ. That's why he rages about judges. That's why he lashes out at prosecutors. The moment someone he assumed was on his side decides to follow the law, he calls it corruption. The moment someone refuses to shield him, he screams witch hunt. The moment someone refuses to obey his demands, he accuses them of trying to destroy America. But let's be really clear here. Following the law isn't corruption. Enforcing accountability isn't tyranny. Rejecting interference isn't political. It's the exact opposite. It's what functioning democracies are supposed to do. And the only reason Trump sees that as an attack is because he's built an entire worldview around the belief that he should be able to do whatever he wants without consequence. And this scandal didn't just expose that belief. It exposed how deeply it's penetrated his network. Because this wasn't fringe. This wasn't a rogue staffer. This was an official with direct White House authority, using that authority to try to influence law enforcement. And here's the discreet, uncomfortable truth. If he had succeeded, if the devices had been quietly returned, if DHS hadn't pushed back, if the agents hadn't leaked, we would have never known. That's the part that should make everyone uncomfortable. Not just the interference, the fact that this interference almost worked. But then something else happened that should terrify Trump's team. The story didn't stay isolated. It triggered a ripple effect. Other federal employees began pointing to similar red flags. Former officials began speaking out. Analysts began connecting threads. And suddenly the question wasn't just why did they interfere, but where else have they interfered? Because once one instance is exposed, it becomes impossible to pretend it's the only one.
And Trump knows that, which is why his reaction to this has been so telling. No calm denial, no measured explanation, just the familiar playbook. Dismissals, contradictions, frantic messaging, attacks on the media, and the always present claim that he has no idea what's going on, even though people acting in his name were sending orders with his authority behind them. And here's the truly dangerous part. This is a preview of exactly how Trump intends to govern if he gets power again. He said it openly. He wants to purge government agencies of anyone who isn't loyal to him personally. He wants to replace career experts with political loyalists. He wants to use federal power the way he thinks other countries use it, as a personal shield and a personal weapon. And this scandal is the clearest demonstration of what that actually looks like. Evidence seized in a trafficking case, he'll try to make it disappear. Federal agents doing their job, he'll accuse them of sabotage. Prosecutors handling criminal cases, he'll call them enemies of the state. Courts ruling against him, he'll claim the system is rigged. Because in Trump's worldview, accountability isn't due process, it's betrayal. And anyone who refuses to protect him becomes the target.
Which brings us to the question Trump fears the most. If this story hadn't come out, if HS agents hadn't spoken up, how far would his administration have gone to protect the people involved? Would they have pressured investigators further, pressured state officials, tried to undermine the international prosecutions? How big was the plan, and how much did Trump himself know?
Those are the questions surfacing right now, and they're not going away. Not because the media is pushing them, but because the facts demand them. You don't insert the White House into a trafficking case unless the stakes are massive. And the stakes here aren't just legal. They're political, cultural, ideological, even psychological. Because if the public fully grasps what this moment represents, then Trump is facing something far worse than a scandal. He's facing exposure. And exposure is the one thing he has never been able to survive.